Good evening. My name is Meg Duguid, and I'm the Director of Exhibitions for the Department of Exhibition, Performing, and Student Spaces at Columbia College, Chicago. I want to welcome you to Avian Effects, Climate Change, and Birds. This is the fourth program for Third Coast Disruptive Artists and Scientists on Climate, an exhibition of newly commissioned artworks culminating from a year-long conversation between 7 artists and 7 scientists centered on climate change, its impacts, and its solutions. It is a feat to put together an exhibition of all newly commissioned works and then add facilitating a discussion among 14 artists and 14 scientists that both acknowledges the very real effects of climate change while focusing on solution-oriented ideas. For this, we have needed a village. This program was created through a collaboration between Columbia College Chicago, DePaul University's Institute for Nature and Culture, and Terracom. We also couldn't have done this without our sponsors and supporters, and especially without the support of the Illinois Arts Council Agency and the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation. We invite you to join us in person at the exhibition, which is currently on view at the Glass Curtain Gallery in Chicago through October 30th, or come visit us online at thirdcoastdisrupted.org or colum.edu/thirdcoast. There you can learn more about the artists and scientists involved, as well as see future programs and recording of past events. Now I would like to introduce Christine Esposito, the project director and lead curator of Third Coast Disruptive. She is the founder of Terracom, a 30-year-old environmental communications firm whose exchange project brings together collaborators to create art and science initiatives like Third Coast Disruptive. Christine.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you everyone for joining us and spending some of your Thursday evening with us. We are so excited about this program, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Forrest Cortes is Director of Community Engagement for the Nature Conservancy in Illinois, where he leads a team that connects people with nature. His team works to achieve co-benefits for human and natural communities, primarily in Cook County. Forrest's interests and expertise lie in urban ecology, volunteer program development, partnership building, and community engagement. He is Vice President of the Chicago Audubon Society. Peggy Macnamara has been artist in residence at the Field Museum for 30 years and is an associate professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She has traveled with Field Museum scientists around the world to paint nature and illustrate conservation efforts. She has published 4 books with museum scientists, including The Art of Migration, Birds, Insects, and the Changing Seasons in Chicagoland. Doug Stotz is a senior conservation ecologist at the Keller Science Action Center of the Field Museum. He's active in programs to preserve biological diversity and threatened habitats, both in Chicago and in other countries. In Chicago, he focuses on studying bird migration, the effects of climate change on bird populations, and the value of urban areas to conserving biodiversity. His authored books include Neotropical Birds, Ecology and Conservation. For our program tonight, we are going to start off with each of our panelists speaking for about 5 minutes on our topic, and then we are going to get into a conversation. We'll get to your questions as well, and conclude, if there's time, with some brief parting thoughts from our panelists. To get started, let's start with you, Doug. Let's hear from you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work properly. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about climate change with respect to birds, and I'm going to have to go quickly. Basically, we talk about the direct effects of temperature, precipitation, increased intensity of storms, but for the most part, the effects on birds are focused on the indirect effects, the things that these changes cause in the ecology of the region. And that can be things like the prey base, changes in habitat, and something I'll talk about a lot more here is the timing of important annual cycle events. At different seasons, there are different things going on due to climate change. In the winter, we mostly see distributional changes with things wintering farther north. Migration, the effects are mostly about timing, when the birds are migrating. And then in the breeding season, all sorts of things come together. But one of the things in the Chicago area is most of the birds are migrants. So there are about 290 migratory species in the Chicago area and only about 15 species that are totally non-migratory. I've estimated that about 14 million individual birds eat the lakefront parks. And in total, they're probably on the order of 50 million migrants going through the Chicago region. There are a number of different groups that are major migrants. Warblers are probably the most notable. Lower right is blackpoll warbler. Sparrows are the next group. That's a fox sparrow. And then there was a yellow-bellied flycatcher. And then a bunch of other groups, thrushes, vireos, wrens, etc. Spring is when things are most interesting. There's a suite of events that happen in the spring that change as the growing season happens. The trees leaf out, insects emerge, birds migrate north, things that are hibernate come out. And the timing of when leaf out occurs is a really crucial thing because insectivorous birds are migrating in spring to take advantage of the insects that are associated with that leaf out. So that's when the biggest diversity, the biggest number of insects occurs. And leaf out is advancing with global warming. It's estimated that it's 4 to 5 days earlier per degree increase in temperature. The other thing in the Chicago area is with warming temperatures, we expect to see an increase in the lake effect. The one thing though for migration is that continental effects could overwhelm these local effects. This shows the change in leaf out in North America since 1983. And basically if it's green, it's earlier. If it's red, it's later. And you can see most of the country, it's earlier. In the Southeast, it's later. And this ties into issues of when the trees don't get enough cold to go into, I've forgotten the word and we'll go on. Okay, so temperature affects phenology in a variety of ways. There are a number of different mechanisms. Different species may respond to different temperature clues, and those clues are related, but they aren't identical. So you can get a mismatch in the timing of events across species because of these changes in the temperature being based on different things. So insects typically are looking at how much warm temperature, so essentially degree days, while some other things, some plants, it's a certain threshold that sets them off. For birds, the timing of bird migration is set by climate and evolutionary time, but it's influenced year to year by when they leave their wintering grounds, where those wintering grounds are, and then the weather conditions once they're underway. They use cues from photoperiods, so the length of the day, to tell them when to go, not weather. And the reason for that is weather is too variable. And if you're in South America, you can't tell what the weather is in Chicago. They don't get cable, they can't see Tom Skilling. So what we've seen in terms of changes to this point due to global warming is the timing of migration is changing. It's getting earlier in the spring. The timing of leaf out is also changing, getting earlier. It's variable because it's tied into the weather. The other thing is that the change in leaf out is much greater than the change in the timing of migration. So birds are falling behind the leaf out. The effects on migration are strongest in the spring because you have this clear phenological event, the leaf out. In the fall, there isn't that event. And for birds, there's selection for the birds to arrive early on breeding ground. The early bird doesn't get the worm, it gets the best breeding territory. So we've done a variety of studies. I'll just mention one looking at McCormick Place, where we've used the data set there to look at the timing of bird migration. And what we found is we looked at 5 very common species. All of those species show an earlier migration of 2 to 7 days over the last 30 years. In the fall, we don't see any change for any of those species. And males migrate before females. And one of the issues was, would there be a change in the relative timing? And we don't see that in these species. So why does this all matter? And one of the things is both birds and plants benefit from birds arriving at leaf out. Birds get food, plants get pest control. And a variety of studies have shown that it makes a difference, that birds that are arriving in a warm year when the vegetation is more advanced, forage more slowly, and there's more insect damage. In spring, the birds are really tied into the timing of oaks, and a number of bird species, a lot of our migrants use oaks preferentially for foraging. And the real question is, what happens if that oak leaf out and peak migration don't correspond? That in the long term, that could make a big difference for both our forests and our birds. In the fall, there's much less effect from climate change. The start of fall migration doesn't seem to be based on temperature. The migration isn't really tied to a phenological event. They just have to get out of here before conditions get too terrible for them. There is evidence that some aerial insectivores, things like swifts and some swallows, might be staying later. And some species that used to disappear in the winter are lingering here. And so like white-throated sparrow stays in the winter, didn't used to, but their timing of their migration has not really changed. And this is my last slide. These are all species of common Illinois migrants that are oak related. And so these are the sorts of species that would be at risk with further climate change. So thanks, I'll turn it back to Christine.
Thank you, Doug.
Yes, go ahead, Peggy, please.
Okay. Ooh. I think all I do is, right? Okay. So I'm an odd fit here. Thank you for Christine for inviting me, but I don't come in as a birder. When I started the migration book, I thought I could learn about birds by picking up dead birds at Northwestern. So for 5 years, I picked up birds at I walked south and north, and then I would bring them to the museum. It still didn't stick very well, but it was at least, it was about migration and about them hitting the windows. Northwestern, by the way, has made a lot of changes and made it safer for birds. Things like this, that May, where there was all those species along the lake. And if you're not good with binoculars, it's easier to pick up a bird by just walking up to windows, and there they all are. It's just that in the beginning, Doug, you'll love this, I would go to Dave and tell him I found a new species. Of course I was wrong, but whatever, that's how I learn about them. Now, painting birds, it began at the Field Museum in the Bird Hall, doing this sort of thing. So I could take the time I needed, and I didn't need to be a photographer. And this is some of the bird exhibit. But eventually, you were one day up on the 3rd floor, there was a whole lot of talking about the hummingbirds that were over at the shed. And I was like, oh, tell me what's going on. And someone mentioned that the hummingbird goes from here to Costa Rica. And I had just taken my mother to Costa Rica. I thought that was quite a trip. So the fact that that little bird could get all the way from here to Costa Rica. So this is how I began the plates. On the right, I drew Costa Rican. On the left, I drew this pattern. But the key thing that happened when I was studying birds for the migration book was I was teaching at the same time about composition. And the day coming up, I planned on talking about John Ruskin, a 19th century you know, sort of art philosopher, whatever, was talking about the 9 laws of composition. So those two things crossed in my studio. I was doing these flock paintings and I was looking at Ruskin. Now, when I did these paintings, I didn't make anything up. The birds were exactly in relation to each other. And every time the composition was successful. So I was like, oh, I guess birds read John Ruskin. And they decided to, I mean, it was the first time in 30 years I got every piece worked. I mean, look at that composition. So, and this, radiation. I don't think I put them all in. This was curvature. But it was just like they had studied Ruskin and they decided to travel in unique compositions. So that was, look at this is another one. Contrast is one of his laws. Isn't it amazing that, well, you don't know my history, but in the beginning, the best I could do was put a bird on a page, and look what I'm accomplishing, because the birds are collaborating with me and producing these compositions. Even sitting in the water, they make a strong composition. The eye moves around, does the right thing. It's just sort of amazing. So I will wait to continue that. The next thing I really got interested in was motion, because all my students at the Art Institute want to be animators. And I remember going home and thinking, I can animate birds, you know. And I was doing the flight for this book. Let me keep going. This kind of thing that I never would have tried, except I was painting birds all day, and then I was influenced by my students who were being animators. And so I just thought, well, I'll make birds move. And some of these this image is in the migration book. And these I did so motion was just something but I think I will need Meg to get me going again. So I will pass it on to Forrest, okay? Because yeah, awesome.
All right.
I got you. Just give me 1 second and I will get you down.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Forrest, you're on.
All right, thank you. Tough act to follow. Both of you are brilliant, and I appreciate you going first. So I don't have any photos to share or any beautiful illustrations or paintings to share, but I wanted to speak with you all a little bit about people. So we have a lot of people talking about birds here. I'm going to talk a lot about people, the people behind the organizations I represent, but also the people behind the efforts to conserve birds locally. I'm focusing on people, well, because it's my job, but also because Doug can out-bird nerd me any day. And finally, because the conservation of birds depends on all of us on the panel, but also on all of you. So my name is Forrest Cortes. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Nature Conservancy's Chicago Urban Program. Our team has 3 pillars of focus related to urban biodiversity, natural infrastructure, and connecting people with nature. Our team weaves these 3 areas together to pursue co-benefits for people and nature, especially in Chicagoland's most climate vulnerable communities, often our communities of color. Our community engagement efforts span across Cook County and includes efforts to improve and promote community access to and ownership of local green space, coordination of volunteer stewardship events, and youth and career training programs. And then because I can't get enough of Chicagoland nature and the people working on this stuff, on my free time I serve as the Vice President on the volunteer board of Chicago Audubon Society. This primarily volunteer-run organization has 50 years of experience introducing people to the world of birds, birding, and conservation. We run regular bird walks across the region in places like McKinley Park, Jackson Park, North Park Village Nature Center, and Camp Pine Woods. We organize events to celebrate nature and birds, and have worked with partners to support collaborative efforts like the Bird Conservation Network, the Bird Collision Monitors Network, and recently the Endangered Piping Plover Monitoring Program at Montrose Beach Dunes. We have to remember that most often, what is good for birds is good for people, especially when we're talking about protecting urban green space as habitat that we both depend on. Everyone has a connection to nature, and one of the most powerful tools that environmentalists have in our belts is our ability to identify and build upon that connection, to inspire people to enjoy and care about the green spaces closest to home that are important for both birds and people. From there, each of us can and must act locally to build on those connections. Find the form of environmental stewardship that is most meaningful to you. Join a birdwalk or advocacy task force through Chicago Audubon Society, or join us with the Chicago Park District and the Nature Conservancy to get out and meet your neighbors while volunteering to restore one of the district's many woodland, dune, marsh, or prairie natural areas. Stewardship can and should take many forms, and even the simple act of responsibly using and enjoying green space is an act of stewardship, just as much as picking up a shovel to plant a tree or native grasses or flowers. We need all forms of stewardship if birds and people are going to survive and thrive in a changing climate.
Thank you, Forrest.
Yes, thank you.
I have to say, I'm sorry, everyone. I was having connection problems and didn't hear a lot of what transpired, but I think I got the gist, and I did get to see your images, Peggy. And hopefully you'll be all be able to hear me as we move forward. To start our discussion, I want to bring the lens out a bit and look at the big picture about migration. We have every spring and every fall, the birders are out in force, along the lakefront, in our forest preserves, in our parks, even walking up and down our neighborhood streets, spying on birds. I would love to hear from our panelists what you feel the allure is of bird migration. And maybe Doug, why don't you want to start us off?
Well, I think the allure is different for different people. For me, it's sort of the fact that what I saw yesterday tells me very little about what I'll see today and the next day. Every day is a new, completely different experience. There are other things too. I mean, I love the fact that when migration is going on, you can see incredible birds in your backyard. When you're standing at a L station, it's just unbelievable how there are all these cool birds everywhere. And then the final thing is that it's just this huge natural phenomenon that's going on all across the world. And thinking about how Chicago is this little microcosm of this just incredible activity that the birds are going through all across the world is just an amazing thought.
And that was the point of the book. And the one I did on Nest too, was to reach a broader public who maybe aren't so good with the binoculars. I remember I was at the north door, and I forget, it wasn't you, Doug, but it was a birder who said to me, I mentioned migration. He took me out the front door to that tree just to the left. And there were, I don't know, 30 vireos. He made a little fake sound. And I thought, I've lived here my whole life, and I've never been blessed by realizing that tree was filled with vireos. So the point is to get everybody out there and to slow down and to listen to, I mean, it's art at its best, what they're doing. So anyway, I'll let Forrest.
I agree with everything that's been shared. And I'd just say there's something about birds and migration that connects to our own lived experiences as people, I think, and as communities of people with shared experiences. Like, birds are largely social animals with languages all their own, and the journeys that they take shape their lives, and people are the same. So we depend on one another, and though we may speak different languages, we find commonality with one another in the journeys we undertake. So I think there's something relatable about migration, whether it's a migration personally across the city or across the country or from another country. And then there's just something moving about the sheer magnitude of migration, especially in Chicago. It's one of the best migratory stopovers in the region. And so it's like you can have your own Discovery Channel or Planet Earth right here in your backyard. And like others have said, you can look out your window, you can look out the bus window, or you can just stop at a local park. You can do it anywhere. So I think it's really accessible too.
Yeah, that's.
One of the things I love about it is that we're just carrying on in our lives. We're just doing our lives, and all of this is happening all around us. And if we happen to dial into it, we can really get treated to a real show. Mm-hmm. Interesting perspectives. What about the, well, no, we're talking about climate change and bird migration. I was going to ask another question, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to ask you is, what about local residents? Residents are birders. People are love to watch birds, and if they don't, they might like to check out birding as a result of this panel. But what can local residents do to both help study birds and migration, and to help improve conditions for birds in the face of climate change? Are there things that people, regular residents who aren't professionals, can do?
It sure would help to visit and bring your children to the Field Museum where they can see the bird and push the button and they'll talk about, you know, it's very easy access. And so I would think it would be the first thing you would do to introduce your family to this wonderful world of, you know, they have North American birds, and then you can do the exotic stuff. And I just think, yeah, that would be my.
So another thing in the Chicago area is essentially our natural areas need our care. And if we don't take care of them, they're going to degrade. And so one thing that people can do is get active in helping with restoration activities. There are volunteer groups. Forrest probably can tell you how to get hold of that information, but that's a really obvious thing that we can all do to help the birds and biodiversity in the Chicago region as a whole. And then the other thing is go out birding and, you know, tell the people, you know, I'm notoriously bad when somebody says to me, "Oh, you're birding, what have you seen?" Because I'd realize they're not going to be interested in what I would tell them about vireos and so on. But I really should, because occasionally when I do, they go, "Wow, I never knew there was all that stuff." Yeah. So.
Building on what Doug shared, I think a lot of folks are surprised to realize that many of the natural areas, so like the prairies, the woodlands that we have here in the city proper, are recreated, right? They're not remnants. So that means that we have staff from different agencies doing their best to recreate this habitat that's necessary for people and wildlife and plants. And so that does require like an inordinate amount of labor. And so these places depend on volunteers, and volunteers have been a huge part of the history of taking care and bringing these natural areas back to the region, you know, starting back to the North Branch Restoration Project and others. But I mentioned earlier how stewardship can take a lot of different forms. So depending on what someone, you know, is comfortable with or able to do or interested in, you can volunteer to monitor. You can start to learn to identify the different birds by coming out to bird walks with some of our agencies. And once you get familiar with it, you can log your observations in eBird. There's programs with the Park District and probably other landowning agencies where you can actually help shepherd nesting purple martins in the city along in their life path. So purple martins are a species in this part of the country that depend entirely on people for survival, human-made cavities, because we've eliminated all their natural cavity nesting sites. And so we have stewards and volunteers along the lakefront at the Park District in partnership with the Nature Conservancy who help to take care of those birds and get the towers ready and cleaned up at the end of the season. And it's kind of a tradition to look forward to. But even just getting out and going on a bird walk and enjoying these spaces is an act of stewardship too, because then you're going to become an advocate for these spaces. So if you're not sure where to start or where's a good place to go birding, you can visit ChicagoAudubon.org. They've got some of the best places highlighted on their site. But nature.org/Illinois for the Nature Conservancy will point you in the direction of different stewardship groups across the state even that you can get engaged with. Doesn't matter. We've got all different landowners, the forest preserves, Cook County. We've got King County Forest Preserves, all the different landowners. We're able to point you in the direction of how to get engaged to take care of the habitat that these birds depend on.
Excellent. I want to follow up and ask Doug, can you talk to us also about, these are all great ideas and exciting and just make you want to drop everything and go do them all. But citizen science projects, Doug, can you talk to us a little bit about those, what people might be able to do with those and kind of the range of involvement that people might be able to have?
So there are all sorts of citizen science projects there, and they range from, I mean, eBird is basically a giant citizen science thing. And for those who aren't into it, eBird is a big system put together by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where all the bird watchers put in their data. And then from that, it's just millions and millions and millions of records about birds. And it's a huge and really wide data set that can be used to look at a lot of things that are going on. So that's one that's based on, and Christmas bird count is another one. So Christmas time is coming up. Birders go out, the crazy birders go out and count birds on really cold days in December and January. And that data has been collected for 100 years and basically tells us much of what we know about the patterns of distribution in the winter. So I mentioned the distributional changes in winter. Most of that information comes from Christmas bird counts. So the thing that citizen science enables us to do is get huge amounts of data that we couldn't otherwise get. And then there are other ones that are a little more formal, like I do breeding bird surveys in the summer, where you stand in one spot and count for 3 minutes and then go a quarter mile and do it again and again in cornfields, basically. But that tells us what's happening with the populations at a much more detailed level than the other things we do. And it's, again, based on citizen science. So there are huge opportunities in birds, but there are opportunities in other groups too. There are butterfly monitors, there are dragonfly monitors. The Field Museum has started a monarch citizen science program looking at the productivity of the milkweeds that are growing in your backyards. All of this, the real big thing that you get from citizen science is a lot of data. There are not enough scientists out there to look at all these things, but there are enough people that we can get that kind of information.
Yes. You know, program too, Mary Henna's program, and I'm talking about getting people interested in birds. So she released the peregrines and now they're nesting all over. And one example is Evanston Library every spring. Mary comes, they get 100 kids sitting in that room. She climbs up a ladder, gets the new little baby, puts them in a box, comes down, and they name them. And I swear those kids, it's an unforgettable experience. There's a little peregrine falcon that's just been named. And then Mary climbs back up the ladder, puts them in. But it says to these kids, you can, you know, Mary Henna was part of a group that decided to encourage the peregrine falcon back in Chicago. It had no habitat left. It nested on, you know, condo decks and things like that. That's probably inaccurate. But the point is they're back. And a young person can see how a scientist and citizen scientists made a difference. So
now Mary Henna is a field museum scientist. Okay.
And so 30 years she's been doing that. But when she goes and the public is witnessing the new baby, you can't believe the excitement. There's something about the furry white ball that everyone just can't. Yeah.
You know, one thing that points out to me is that you don't have to know birds to be able to get involved in either in the science or in the restoration. You might learn about birds, or you might want to learn about birds along the way, but that isn't a requirement.
I was just about to say, Christine, you read my mind, that a lot of this about, like, it can be intimidating. Like, I don't know how to identify every bird, or what if I get it wrong? But I think about my own experience, and I went to school for wildlife ecology, but I learned the most by just spending time at volunteer restoration days. That's where I learned my plants. And then I learned my birds by just getting out with people who knew their birds and just shadowing them and bugging them and asking questions. And I think that's something that anyone can do who wants to get engaged, but is kind of overwhelmed by the magnitude of it. It's like, just get out, and there's people that want to mentor you, and there's a lot of experiences to just get engaged in this stuff for free, and then you'll get hooked. And I think there's probably a lot of people on here that can attest to that. I see some faces that got hooked and are still doing it after many, many years. So
yes, I got hooked. I want to switch gears a little bit, and this question will start with you, Peggy, and you'll see why very shortly. I'm wondering what role art plays both in building appreciation and awareness of birds and migration and engaging people in efforts to help protect them, and again, in the face of climate change, especially. And part two of that is there a potential to expand that role?
Well, the Art Institute over the last 10 years has opened up a whole science program that wasn't there when I started, because the students want a balance between science and art. Not that, you know, creating, yeah, well, what would I call it? Real contemporary stuff, you know, people are tired of having to come up with a concept that they don't feel, you know, it really suits them. And something as basic as science and being able to contribute. And the students love coming to the museum, love anything they can do for the Keller Center, love, you know, I mean, it all, when their work can contribute to something rather than just hailing how great they are, it's much more meaningful. At least to the generation that I'm teaching now would make free guides for everybody, you know, insects, birds, what, you know, because they want to save their earth, and with their skills, they're able to at least put out the word that these things are magnificent and beautiful. And so, yes.
So it's kind of the applied art, a practical kind of type and use of art. And that's what you're saying, distinguishing that from kind of more conceptual explorations.
Look for an art history book that covers all of time. They won't mention Audubon. It was like a bad thing to be an illustrator. And that is changing gradually because our earth needs people to paint about it. You know, I'm doing underwater, and so I'm doing coral reefs that are disappearing. So that'll be in a book and someone will see it, and then maybe they will care about, it's amazing. You can see it on, you know, any Netflix thing, but to have it in your hand. So I think that's what I find in the upcoming artist group. They want to make.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all. I'm good.
To have that image created by a hand too, you know, you said you can see it on whatever National Geographic or Netflix, but then to have that imagery created by someone's hand, as you say, might be another form of engagement, I guess.
Yeah,
you might be saying.
It's, as there's 300 graduating seniors every year, and this is how the faculty comes by. They'll go, oh, there's one of yours over there. And I'll walk over and there's a whole wall of bugs or a whole wall of birds. They're not mine. That's the next generation. You know, they want, yeah. And what a wonderful thing to paint. And you want good instincts, you want to be a good painter, well then study perfectly made things. That's my message. Don't read a book about it. Just take a, you know, a perfectly made insect or bird and study, and your instincts will be improved. So enough art. Yeah.
Enough art. Well, Forrest, do you have some, I imagine you might have some thoughts about that as an engagement tool.
Yeah, so from a conservation practitioner standpoint, art is a community engagement tool, absolutely. Art is experienced in different ways by different people, and many times it resonates emotionally when the facts and the figures and the diagrams don't for some folks. And so works of art like those featured in this gallery can move people to appreciation and action, and especially when coupled with real life outdoor experiences. I'd love to see more intersectional programming like this. It's just as scientists need data on bird populations to design effective conservation strategies, we also need to ground our strategies in data from human communities about relationships to nature. So understanding that people see nature in different ways and people experience nature in different ways, because we can't have successful conservation strategies without an understanding of that. So art can serve as a bridge in that way. Right now, the Nature Conservancy is expanding our environmental engagement toolkit by working with Latinos Progresando and Open Center for the Arts on an initiative called Step Out. And this is a call for artists seeking works from North and South Lawndale. Artists will receive grants to work on pieces that visualize the connection between nature, people, and health. And this call for artists will be followed by a series of art making workshops with the community, because I believe that everyone's a little bit of an artist. I'm like the least, because I can't even draw a stick figure properly, but I believe everyone has a little artist in them. So the idea is to create a foundation of understanding upon which we can build future strategies to improve environmental health and green spaces for birds and bees, but also for the people.
Mm.
Wow. Wow. Doug, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you are kind of an art inclined person. You've spent some time at the intersection of art and science. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I was going to say that I would battle Forrest for least artistic person on the planet, but my mother thought if I was going to make a career working on birds, I'd have to be an artist like, you know, Roger Tory Peterson or Ray Harm, or, you know, there were a lot of great bird artists, and all my birds look like crossbills, so they're really fat, no matter what they look like in real life. So it was not made for me. And, you know, but it's interesting, something that I don't fully appreciate is how, you know, I show a beautiful picture of a beautiful bird, and I think that's what people should look at, but they get a lot more out of the drawing of that bird, or the, you know, Peggy's watercolors. I mean, in some ways, they end up being a lot more evocative of what's out there. And, you know, one of the things you should notice is field guides. So bird field guides are still primarily based on paintings. They're not based on photos. And it's because, you know, the photos have limits in what they can show you. They can only show you what that angle shows you, while with the artistic work, you can show things in a little bit different way so that you can see everything you want to show. So, you know, and that remains the case. You know, there are a lot of attempts to do field guides with photos, and they just don't work as well as the field guides using artwork.
That's interesting. And if anyone's ever tried to look at a warbler, it's a lot easier to look at a drawing of one than one in real life, because they're so fast moving. So there's that. I want to ask about partners. You know, collaboration, we fortunately is a growing trend, thank goodness. And I want to find out if there are partners that haven't been tapped yet for helping to improve conditions for migratory birds, or partners that are involved but haven't been, you know, taken advantage of, I mean that in a positive way, in as much as they could be.
Yeah, Doug, talk about Dave's 40 years and how the city has cooperated in turning lights out, and those are partners that you wouldn't have thought of that
Right.
stepped up, but Doug knows that.
So in my presentation, I talked about data from McCormick Place, and this is something we've been picking up dead birds at McCormick Place since the 1970s. And that's a data set that we work with, but one of the things we discovered in doing it was it made a big difference whether the lights were on and off. And so we worked with the bird conservation groups. Chicago Audubon was a big player in that, the Bird Conservation Network, and created, and basically they created, we provided data to support it on how turning off the lights made a big difference in the number of birds that was killed. When the lights are off, you kill, our data from McCormick Place says it's like 80 to 90% fewer birds when the lights are off compared to when they're on. And so Chicago created a Lights Out program under Mayor Daley, and that program continues to this day. There's, as I saw in the chat, mention of the Chicago Bird Collision Monitors, which is a group that goes out and checks other buildings besides McCormick Place. The birds that are dead end up at the Field Museum. The birds that are alive get rehabbed and released again. And Um, it's a huge issue, the number of birds that are hitting buildings. And Chicago has recently been identified as the most dangerous place for birds in the country because of a combination of, we have a big city with lots of big buildings and a lot of light, and we're one of the biggest areas for migration. So that combination makes Chicago extraordinarily dangerous for birds.
Wow.
Yeah, that's sobering, but it is exciting to hear, you know, the idea who, as you said, Peggy, who would think building owners and managers, you know, that's some great, exciting collaboration and effective, making such a difference.
Yeah, the Lights Out program relies on the building managers to make it happen. We can't get those lights turned off, and they're really good about it.
It's so nice.
Yeah, I would say one thing that's true is that we've done a great job, conservation organizations in the region especially, you know, through Chicago Wilderness and other collaborations have done a great job of working with one another, environmental organization to environmental organization. But what we have a lot of work to do on is working with community-based organizations that don't have a specific conservation focus or environmental focus in their primary mission headline, right? Because I mean, what we know is that people need nature, nature needs people, and that if we're going to tackle the challenges that climate change brings, and if we're going to protect birds and protect habitat, we need to work outside of the box. And so there's a lot of ways that this is starting to take shape, but I think one of the most important things to remember is that we have to give to people and to communities if we expect people and communities to give to our causes. And that can sound kind of transactional, but it's really about getting to know the communities that we have, you know, maybe unintentionally or perhaps in some cases intentionally ignored for many years. You know, communities of color in Chicago who have not had the same opportunities to connect with birds, have not had the same opportunities to connect with internships and things like that in the past. So the environmental movement is only now beginning to truly embrace and welcome expertise, I believe, outside of our traditional approach to conservation. And we need artists, social justice activists, neighborhood associations, and everything in between if we're going to move the needle on climate change. So, but beyond that, we need to engage respectfully and intentionally to make sure that we're not stepping on toes of people that have been working in communities for a really long time. And we need to make sure that our strategies have benefits for people, not just birds and habitat. So conservation for nature's sake alone doesn't resonate with everyone. I mean, that's something that people don't like to hear, but that's not how everyone sees it. People have other priorities that can sometimes come up first. And so we have to find common ground and set joint goals with our partners outside of our wheelhouse. And then we end up winning when we do that. We open the door to new audiences, to new potential advocates, to new grant opportunities for our work, and also to new approaches that we wouldn't have dreamed up without the input of new partners. One of my favorite examples that I'm going to drop in the chat right now is a solidarity ride through South Lawndale that both Chicago Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy and a host of other organizations are helping to sponsor. And this event is called Birds, Bikes, and Environmental Justice. So it's taking folks out through South Lawndale to visit and speak with different representatives of community organizations that run community gardens, who have advocated to get a park placed in the community that has some of the smallest amount of park space in the whole city. And it's going to take folks through a ride, and there's going to be birding and talking about some of the challenges like air quality that are faced by people in the communities as well. So it's, again, it's all about solidarity with the Black and brown communities in North and South Lawndale. And it's going to be a really awesome event. So I dropped the event link in the chat, but that's just one example of how spending time in communities intentionally, caring about communities and not just about the nature in communities is really important if we're going to actually succeed in our conservation goals in a city, especially more than anywhere else.
Words,
Right.
that was great.
Yeah, that's a perfect spot for us to pause and look at people's questions. We have some time for some questions, and I do see one from Laura Dirks, multi-part. It's she's commenting about how magical migration is and wondering how does nature know to move? How do they know that the food sources are there or here, you know, thousands of miles away? And the big philosophical question, what can we as one species learn from the many bird species who will go to great lengths to survive and thrive?
Mhm.
That philosophical question is beyond my small brain's ability to respond to. The in terms of, I mean, birds use time their movements based on the photo period so that it gets them arriving in Chicago or wherever you're looking at about the right time for the conditions that they need in order to survive. Some years spring is late, some years spring is early, and the birds essentially have to, do calculus. They're much smarter than we are. Do calculus to figure out when is the best time to arrive given that variability. And there are years when they're early. They get here before the food supply is really ready. And in those situations, you see things, and those are the times when I get calls from people saying, I've never seen this bird before. It's at my feeder. It's all blue. And that's an indigo bunting. And it's because there isn't the natural food that they would rely on. And then there are other years when they arrive where the things are past. So there are a lot of things that take advantage of the insects that are in elms. So there's one species that pupates ordinarily in early May, right when the warblers are arriving. But in a warm spring, that may happen too early and those birds miss it. And so there are different things they're trying to deal with. And it's a difficult thing. I mean, migration is a very dangerous thing for birds to do, but they do it anyway. And so one of the questions is, why do they do it? And there's a lot of thinking about it. And the issue is, if you come up to North America, you have we think of how rich South America is, but the number of insects that are in North America just puts South America to shame in the number of individuals. And people don't believe me when I tell them, but like when I go to South America, my wife is going to be horrified by this. Basically, I don't use insect repellent because there aren't enough bugs to worry about, or not enough individual bugs to worry about. In Illinois, I can't do my breeding bird surveys without wearing insect repellent because there's so many mosquitoes. And the birds can take advantage of that. They come here to take advantage of that, but they can't stay because winter, everything screeches to a halt. So they have to go south, but they come up here to take advantage of that rich time. And it's something that's evolutionary. It's built into them. They can adjust it, but they can't really change it.
Wow. We have time for one more question, and we have had actually a couple questions about this regarding the die-off in the southeast. Wondering if that had anything to do with climate change. Maybe Doug, you can tell us what happened.
I answered a bit in the chat on that.
Oh, okay.
And it was in the Southwest. And,
Southwest.
And it was thought that it might be related to the fires, but I think more likely, and they're still working on it. They've collected a lot of birds and they're looking to see if there are toxins that might indicate fire, or whether it's that they're emaciated, which is food supply. And the thing that happened besides the fires at that time was a big winter storm that hit really early, and temperatures dropped from the 70s and 80s to the 30s in 24 hours, and it dropped a foot of snow in the mountains of Colorado, and it forced the birds to move before they were ready. And so you had birds that hadn't refueled sufficiently, and I think basically they starved to death because they were forced out early, and they were going into New Mexico where conditions were better, but they still weren't good enough to provide the support. So I think that's what was going on. In what that is a weather event, and this is one of the tricks with climate versus weather. That was a weather event, but climate is creating more of those types of weather events. That was a massive storm, and that's one of the things that climate change leads to, are these massive storms. In this case, it was a cold one. In some cases, it's a warm one. I mean, we have an incredible hurricane season going on right now, and that again ties back into the climate change. Each individual hurricane is a weather event, but the pattern is what is climate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, I'm going to throw in one more. I think the panelists probably won't be upset if we don't do our parting 30 seconds, so we can take one more question. And it's a question wondering what events the Field Museum or the Nature Conservancy, I'm going to guess, Forrest, you're going to want to jump right on this, are doing to raise visibility to, I'm thinking maybe it's of Latinx and Black birders in the Chicago area. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of individual things that are happening, but I think it all goes back to meeting people where they're at and recognizing that there's expertise outside of places like Montrose Beach, which is, don't get me wrong, it's like one of my favorite places in the city, but there's expertise and there are birders in all parts of the city. And by meeting people where we're at, we're discovering birders we haven't been connected to before, nature lovers we haven't been connected to before. And that means, you know, hosting a bilingual bird walk, not just assuming that folks can just show up and participate in an English bird walk. That just happened at Humboldt Park. Chicago Audubon Society, Nature Conservancy, and Lucha, a housing association in Humboldt Park, collaborated to host that event. And so there's a lot of work happening and there's a lot of work to be done still, but really it comes down to just spending time with communities where we haven't spent a lot of time, and especially in Black and Brown communities, understanding that there's expertise there that we need and that also we can benefit from knowing, and it's not just us coming with expertise to the table.
And I think birds made the first move. Remember that rare bird that came to the park in Lawndale?
Yeah.
6 or 7 years ago. Yeah, because my sister teaches there, and suddenly there were all these guys from California in the middle of, yeah. So the birds got the idea. We got to mix it up. We got to go to other communities.
Yeah, and I think I mean, Forrest brings up a good point about the need for bilingual stuff. It's just amazing to me that there's still only one bird field guide in Spanish, which is Ken Kaufman's guide, and that came out 20 years ago, and none of the other guides have created bilingual ones. Field Museum is trying to do that for a variety of things. And the other thing I would say is that if you're on Twitter, you might check out the hashtag, was it Black Birders Week? Was that what it was? Yeah, Black Birders Week. And so for a period of week, they focused on Black birders in the US, and they had a Facebook Live event, or a couple of Facebook Live events, and their tweets all through about people talking about their experiences as Black birders. And I saw in the chat, someone mentioned Drew Lanham, who's a professor at Clemson and is an incredible role model, as well as an incredible ornithologist who's done a lot of work to try to bring the Black community more into nature.
I would just say lastly, really quickly, Doug, you made me think of something that the environmental movement needs to continue to understand the barriers to access that people have in different communities. That, you know, just because I can walk to a park distant from my house doesn't mean that I actually can, just because it's walking distance. There might be things that get in the way, you know, invisible gang lines, there could be cultural barriers. And so I think that we haven't spent enough time in many communities to even understand why there's a disconnect. And sometimes there isn't even a disconnect. We just don't know that there's Black birders. We just don't know that there's Latinx birders because we haven't taken the time to get to know those communities. So that's my last plug for just spending more time in communities where we historically haven't, and making sure we're being aware of what we bring to those communities and what we learn from those communities.
Excellent. Oh my goodness, I wish we had another hour. Again, it feels like we're just getting started, but I suppose that's the nature of the beast. We do need to draw our program to a close, however, and I want to thank our panelists. This has been a phenomenal conversation, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. We do have one more program associated with Third Coast Disrupted, and that's 2 weeks from tonight, October 22nd. It's Getting Around Carbon, New Looks at Transportation, and that's sponsored by the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation. And just like tonight, we'll have an artist and a scientist among the panelists for that. You can learn more about that program and register for it at thirdcoastdisrupted.org or as Meg said, Column, that's colum.edu/thirdcoast. And in at those two sites, you can also learn more about our exhibition, which closes 3 weeks from tomorrow. So if you're planning to go see it, it's starting to wind down. But we are also working to have it available virtually because we do have a pandemic going on. So if you're uncomfortable going to the gallery, you will have that option. And we will be posting the recording of this talk online. Our past talks are available and our future one will be posted as well. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you everyone for joining us and have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Hi, Christine.